Hola, buenas tardes, bienvenidos a Lighthouse de nuevo. Estamos hoy con el doctor Matthiasem Rath. Es para mí un honor presentar a este doctor alemán. Era director del Instituto Paul Linus Pauling y ha hecho dos libros importantes. El primero es Victoria sobre el cáncer, que habla de medicina celular, y el segundo, y para mí fundamental y súper interesante, es el de las raíces nazis de la Unión de Bruselas, donde ahonda sobre temas económicos y políticos, sobre todo de las farmacéuticas. Bienvenido, Matthias. How are you?
Bien.
Okay. I've been listening to you, and you are exceptional. I'm very honored to have you here in this interview. I know that you've been director of Linus Pauling Institute.
This was
a long time ago, probably.
Ago. Mm-hmm.
What is the importance of vitamins for human beings?
Vitamins mean life.
Okay.
Every cell is only working if the energy is being created within what is called the biological power plants of the cells, or mitochondria. And the fuel, the main fuel these cells use to function properly, are vitamins and other micronutrients. So the sentence "vitamins mean life" is a good summary of what the significance is.
Okay. How do you connect this medicine and cells and vitamins with power, with politicians, with pharma cartel?
I didn't do that in the beginning. I was a scientist who was interested in solving problems of human health, starting with cardiovascular disease, and I started off very conventionally at the medical school in Hamburg and doing research in what causes atherosclerosis, and then stumbled on the role of vitamin C in that context, at which point I thought that everyone should be interested in this discovery. Mm-hmm. And it was over a long process of learning for me that I realized the interest groups in the field of health, and that vitamins or any substances that are not patentable are not only unwanted, they are being actively fought. And research into this field of natural, non-patentable health is being neglected, obstructed by the status quo for economic reasons primarily. Mm-hmm. And they are, in a nutshell, the following. The pharmaceutical industry is dominating the healthcare field at this point in time, and it is an investment industry, which means that the value this industry creates comes from molecules that they create, they invent, they mm-hmm. synthesize, and they patent. And therefore, they, by the very nature of their business, must protect this business principle of patented pharmaceutical drugs. And from that analysis follows that in order to protect their markets with these patented drugs, they need to fight everything that undermines these markets by, for example, showing that vitamins can prevent atherosclerosis, and that the hardening of the arteries is a precursor of vitamin deficiency disease, scurvy. Mm-hmm. I'm undermining a multi-billion-dollar business with calcium antagonists, beta blockers, diuretic preparations, ACE inhibitors, etc. That was something I didn't know at the time when I went into that field of scientific investigation. But I think it's part of life, it's part of human beings that we need to adapt. And together with my colleagues, we know that many diseases, human diseases that kill millions of people today in Spain and other countries, are actually caused, directly caused, or favored by long-term vitamin deficiencies. And once you know that as a scientist, and once there is someone who, or there are interest groups that obstruct you from telling that or researching that, or even want to put you to prison so that you can no longer say that, then you need to take a decision, and that decision is, are you going to fight these interests, or are you just giving in? There's no middle way.
There must be a big interest, it's big money around
it. It is, yeah.
Can you define what companies or what groups control this?
Well, I think the largest export nation of pharmaceutical drugs currently is the US, followed by Great Britain, and then I believe still Germany and Japan, France are some of the following nations. And that global market share defines generally the support by the respective governments. Historically speaking, Germany has been the lead export nation of pharmaceutical drugs during the previous century, but that has shifted slightly. The companies, well, the companies are the same, and yes, but it doesn't bring us further in our battle if we start attacking individual companies. It is the principle we need to understand, the principle of the pharmaceutical business with disease. A few years ago, I formulated what I call the laws of the pharmaceutical industry, and the first law was to say a pharmaceutical industry is not a health business, it is an investment business, which is an important realization, because people think, oh, pharmaceutical industry, this is, these are the guys that provide health. No, no, no. They pretend to provide health. And their true nature of existence is to make money from the patented products. Secondly, second law was that the prevention and elimination of disease is not the primary target of this, or primary interest of this industry, but in fact the maintenance of these diseases and their promotion, even the invention of new diseases, because that is the business they are in. Diseases are their markets, so they need to keep them alive and expand them. Third is they of course cannot say that openly, because people and governments would revolt. So there's about 50 to 60% of the money they spend is in what they call marketing, which is of course the deception to cover what they really do.
It's a lot of power, a lot of money.
A lot of power. And in the lead export nations of pharmaceutical products, there has been a long-standing connection between these corporate interests and government officials and regulatory agencies, and etc., etc. Take, for example, Germany. The entire German nation after World War II, was called West Germany, was created around the chemical pharmaceutical cartel, Bayer, BASF, Höchst. Several chancellors came directly from these companies and were promoted into the highest office, meaning the Chancellor of Germany.
Like Helmut Kohl.
Helmut Kohl was a lead person, and of course the people around him, Mr. Schäuble, Angela Merkel, are direct offsprings of Helmut Kohl's era. And all areas of German society have been affected by the very nature of the power of these interest groups, and whether that is medicine, a strong connection into the medical schools, what you learn as a medical student, strong connection into the media, a strong connection even in the legal system, so that when you are being attacked as someone who is challenging the pharmaceutical interests, you face an uphill battle, because the pharmaceutical interest is just the common denominator of that society.
Good. Tell me, what do you say in your book? What is it about?
Which book?
The one with the United Europe.
The Nazi roots of the Brussels EU.
What is the connection between these big groups, pharmaceutical, with the politicians and the Nazis in the wars?
Well, first, the people of the world were told about history that there was World War I, and it just happened. Some states, some kings or emperors at that time ended up in some rivalry, and suddenly there was war. Not so. This war was a war of conquest, organized, conceived, strategically planned by pharmaceutical and chemical cartel, namely Bayer, BASF, Hoechst, who at that time had the lead in identifying new molecules, reproducing them, patenting them, owning them, and they wanted to export this model to other countries. Now, these other countries, they didn't want to be controlled by them, so they needed to organize a military adventure, military conquest of these countries. And now we understand that the World War I was nothing less than the first attempt of this new industry, the chemical, pharmaceutical concentration of power, to claim the domination of Europe and the world. And then this adventure ended in a defeat, luckily, at the price of millions of people dying. And the German emperor was sent into the exile, and the corporate interest continued and invested in the Nazis. And Bayer, BASF, Hoechst, by that time they had formed the IG Farben cartel, became the largest supporter of the Nazis' rise to power. And at the end of World War II, after the defeat after 1945, there was even a specific trial where 24 managers of IG Farben were tried for the crimes they committed in Nuremberg. But that is just the backdrop of this book. What really triggered me to initiate this project was that we were able to find documents about the key architect of the Brussels EU. Unbeknown to most people, this was a gentleman by the name of Walter Hallstein. Walter Hallstein was a prominent lawyer in Nazi Germany. He was member of a delegation that was sent down by the Hitler regime to Rome to negotiate with the Mussolini lawyers about the future shape of Europe after they had conquered Europe. That was in June 1938, 1.5 years, or 14 months before they started World War II. They knew they would do this, they knew they would launch this war, and they started to think, how are they going to administer this conquered countries? What are the laws, the administrative regulations? And Hallstein was the key person in the German delegation for the new architecture of a Nazi cartel Europe. luckily that didn't happen, and everyone thought that key people of that nature would actually go to prison or would be sentenced and removed from public office or, you know, put away. Not so with Mr. Hallstein. When he was interrogated by what was called the denazification committee of the Allies, there were specific committees set up to make sure that the Nazis could not continue with their philosophy, and when he was interviewed, he lied to them. They had to sign a document indicating whether they were members of Nazi organizations and were promoting that philosophy and stuff like that. And we got hold of that document, yes. And we saw that he was just outright lying. He was member of the most notorious professional organization of the Nazis, which was the Nazi Association of what they called protectors of the law. I mean, the Nazi law, you know. And he was a lead figure for the Nazi state in these negotiations. And he just lied. He just said, well, I'm innocent. And that was his entree into the next life. And he was picked up by the first German Chancellor Adenauer. And they promoted to the position of the first promoted to the chief negotiator for preparing the Rome treaties, which became in 1957 the first legal foundation of the Brussels EU. And then he was promoted by the West German government to become the first president of the EU Commission. And he was given 8,000 and something bureaucrats, people working under him, only responsible to this one person, to create what we today know as the Brussels EU Europe, including the undemocratic structures that the Brussels the EU Commission was created as an exclusive executive committee. Responsible to literally no one. That's how it's phrased. Not the people, not the governments, to no one. They have the exclusive right to initiate legislation. Where are we? We're living in the 21st century and everyone thinks we are living in a democracy. It's outright dictatorship there on behalf of corporate interests. And it's fantastically masked by the propaganda that is being made to praise Europe as the model of peace and the model of prosperity, and etc., etc. And it's only now that the crisis that this model initiated, the one-sidedness for the corporate interests in Spain and other countries in Europe, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, and so on. So pretty soon France and ultimately also Germany. It is only now that this crisis is breaking open that these facts can be traced back to their origin. So in a nutshell, the Hallstein documents were, for me, the main reason to launch this project. I was very happy to have good colleagues working with me. Dr. Nitsuki, my long-standing colleague from Poland, Paul Taylor, and of course August Kowalczyk, who is a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And with his support for this book, he of course was adding a lot of authenticity as one of the victims of Auschwitz. Auschwitz being, of course, 100% subsidiary of IG Farben at the time.
And what was it used for, Auschwitz? What were they doing in Auschwitz?
Well, that's another something else that few people know. We've been told that there was the Auschwitz concentration camp, but it was run by crazy SS people, and it was basically a racially motivated concentration and extermination camp, which in fact it was in part. But the reason why it became that factory of death was the decision of I.G. Farben in 1941 to build what was to become the largest corporate structure outside Germany, wartime Germany. 24 square kilometer size industrial plant to produce synthetic rubber and other war essential synthetic products which they needed for the conquest of Russia and Eastern Europe and Asia ultimately. And I.G. Auschwitz, this huge plant in the city of Auschwitz, required a lot of slave labor, and so the nearby concentration camp of Auschwitz was turned into a giant slave labor camp. And slave labor, of course, meant at the time that if you were working at the I.G. Farben construction site of building this monster of synthetic production plant, you were only needed by Bayer, BASF and Höchst as long as you could work. Once you were sick or they had worn you out, there was no health insurance or retirement plan. They were killed, and thousands of them were just killed. It was called extermination through labor. And if you remember that sentence, labor liberates, it was the Nazi speak, or Nazi newspeak, I should say. And if you remember the inscript on the concentration camp of Auschwitz, labor liberates, Arbeit macht frei. It was Nazi newspeak for exactly the opposite. It was killing, extermination through slave labor. And also the experiments, the medical experiments then were not conducted on behalf of the SS. The SS was a troop of murderers. They didn't have the intelligence to create drugs or anything commercially accessible and of any value. They were the guys who executed the commercial interests of Bayer and Höchst, mainly those two companies, who tested their drugs, patented drugs, new drugs, in Auschwitz and Buchenwald and some other smaller concentration camps in order to make them ready for the world market. And now when all that has been part of the Nuremberg War Crime Tribunals, at the time when we started this work, there was nothing, absolutely nothing about the tribunal from Nuremberg on the web, the tribunal from Nuremberg against I.G. Farben, against Bayer and BASF and Höchst, on the web. In fact, there were no books, it wasn't in printed form available either. And I got curious, I said, well, how much money do you need to spend from these companies to cover your past? Not just in the newspapers, but also in books, in the history books, in everything our children are being taught in school about the origin of World War II. And so we, our foundation, went ahead and we found quite some documents in national archives about this trial, and we published by now about 50,000 of these records on Profit Over Life online, and there's no way that the current understanding of World War II by the general public, that it was a racially motivated war, can be upheld. There's no way. It was the second attempt of the chemical pharmaceutical cartel from Germany at a world conquest based on 40,000 patents or what they had at the time, trying to impose that economic money printing machine on the world.
Do you think it might be a third attempt to do it?
Yeah, obviously what we see today is, going back to 1945, again what we saw is that the political and the military puppets were sentenced in Nuremberg to death or to lifetime in prison, and rightly so. But the puppeteers, the guys who actually planned this war and made it possible and hired the Nazis to implement it, they were sentenced with a few years, like for example the CEO, the chief executive of Bayer, Termier, was sentenced to 7 years in prison in 1948. In 1956, 8 years later, he was not only out of prison, he was back as the chairman of the board of Bayer again. Now, what do we learn from that? We learn from it that the interest groups had a certain continuity. And that was in 1956, exactly the year when the final documents on the Brussels EU were signed. When the German government, with Bayer being its corporate flagship, became the driving force of this Brussels EU. And you can see that by the mid-50s, 10 years after their second attempt failed, they were back in business, and they were right at it to create the third attempt, this time without military component, but by means of a heinous strategy of economic strangulation and of political coercion. At that time, 60, 70 years ago now, they knew that the day would come that Spain is in this crisis that is today, that Italy will soon be there, that Greece is in this. They knew that at that time. And that was their target, that was their goal, predetermined goal.
It's all planned.
Excuse me?
It's all planned.
It was all planned. And you will see that in a few days there will be some politicians meeting in Brussels or Strasbourg and saying, oh, we should take advantage of this crisis and unite and make a political union out of Europe, or the United States of Europe. And so, shall we say, 7 decades after their second attempt failed, they reached their ultimate goal, almost. Meaning that they create a body in Europe that rules every part of life, not democratically. You cannot elect them, you cannot throw them out of office. They are there to control you and your life. With the Brussels EU, yeah. So the Brussels EU, the construct of the Brussels EU is the third attempt. And they never came that close. I mean, some people say, oh, you know, the Nazis were ruthless destroyers they were just there to destroy everything. It's crazy thought. They were ruthless, they were criminals, and there's nothing better to say about them. They deserved every punishment in the world, but they were hired because of their ruthlessness by these corporate interests. And the interests of these corporate interests, they were not interested in destruction. They were interested in making one thing, money, and controlling that, and controlling the markets, and turning Europe into a platform to conquer the world. And this is where they are now. If you see the Brussels EU envoys flying to Africa and saying, hey, African Union, you need to model your continental government according to the Brussels EU. And suddenly you have a commission of the African Union. And they go to South America, to the Mercosur, and they go to Southeast Asia, to the ASEAN states, and they sell their model as the future of I don't know what, of an Orwellian world or what?
Probably. World order.
One world order, yeah. And they know they cannot accomplish that in one sweep, so their plan is to do it with those regional, continental takeovers, exporting the undemocratic Brussels model to other continents, and then ultimately uniting it under one umbrella, obviously, yes.
So how do you see the future? Are you optimistic with your foundation? I think you came to Spain, you have a foundation here.
Yes. Well, we came to Spain not because...
What can we do to fight this fascist model, let's say?
The key element is education. And you mentioned this book. I think it has already become part of rewriting history, just understanding who was behind World War I and II, understanding who were the architects of the Brussels EU. That's the basis for change. You cannot motivate people if they do not understand. You cannot motivate people if they do not understand the origin of the problem. If you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. So, am I optimistic? Yes, otherwise I wouldn't be talking to you. And
do we have time to do this?
Well, I'll put it like that. I gave a talk in Berlin 3 months ago. And we put it online on YouTube, not knowing what would come, and suddenly we had how many now? I think 300,000 people saw that video from Spain alone. So I doubt that the interest in this message would have been that great if the crisis would not be here. So there is always something in a critical situation that brings mankind forward, provided it has the right strategies, and provided it unites behind these strategies and fights for it. And when we saw the great interest in this national message from Berlin, from Spain, we decided that it's time to come here and see what we can bring to this country. The direction is very clear. I think there are a series of things that need to be done immediately. We need to inform people so that they, with the knowledge they have about the background of the Brussels EU, about the undemocratic structure, recognizes that what it is, dictatorial construct artificially put there by corporate interests. They have the possibility to say no, to motivate their governments to go away. The fact that the Spanish government did not simply go under this umbrella of the Brussels EU is already a fact, or is already reflecting, I should say, the fact that the government of Spain knows the instant conditions that come with that step, meaning you're giving up your sovereignty. So education, empowering people to say no and turn their back on this construct. Secondly, the euro is nothing else than the tool of tying the nations, the economies of Europe to this construct in Brussels. The fact that Brussels, as I said before, is not a sign or a consequence of a strong position of the cartel interests, is important to analyze too. We need to understand that the economic interests behind the Brussels EU are not in a very strong position. They have a lot of money, influence, etc., but the technologies they are trying to sell are outdated.
What do you mean? What kind of technologies?
Take, for example, in the field of energy, the key interest behind Brussels are the petrochemical industry, the oil cartel, and more recently the nuclear energy cartel, and these are outdated technologies. I mean, people in Spain and everywhere, they demand electrical cars, and in Germany, even up in Germany, you won't find a village where you don't have solar cells on the panels on the roofs. And we are here in Spain. I mean, this country should be selling electrical current to other countries because of the abundance of sunshine in this country. And here they are in Brussels trying by all means to defend these outdated technologies against the will of the people. So it's obvious that they need this dictatorial construct, not because they are bad people, but no one will buy their merchandise if they don't protect it. And the same goes for the health sector. I mean, my own life has been, I was privileged to contribute to some discoveries in the area of heart disease and cancer, and everywhere the breakthrough didn't come from patented pharmaceutical drugs. It came from natural ingredients from plants and other biologically active substances. And there too, they're afraid of this development, and they're trying to ban it, and they're trying to protect this investment business around the pharmaceutical drugs. So that's a weakness. And we need to understand this weakness for two reasons. First of all, from a practical point of view, it gives us a fantastic democratic opportunity, not just to say we don't want that and we demonstrate, but to start doing something right away in Spain to promote solar energy as the #1 source of energy for your home, for your corporation, for the country. Spain is an agricultural country. What's wrong with starting a completely new industry, saying we are growing fields of plants of which we know these are powerful anti-cancer agents, and isolate these substances not in micrograms but in grams, prepare, or in kilograms, in tons, and export them. Create injectable solutions so that the concentration in late-stage cancer can be still increased, and so on and so forth. So what I'm seeing is that, in fact, the countries hardest hit from the crisis have the greatest potential for creating something new. And I think since I assume that some people in Spain may watch this interview, it is your responsibility to think about those aspects and take decisions if you agree with it, and put the pressure on your government and say, hey, why are we always talking about new conditions from outside, about dependency, about giving up our sovereignty? Here we have great potentials in key area of our life which lay bare and which we can use instantly. And so there's this very practical aspect, but equally significant is the moral and, should I say, historical aspect of that. By simply saying no to Brussels, nothing will change. We may or may not get rid of these mobsters, but by taking away their economic base, meaning their business in energy, their business in the healthcare sector, their fraudulent business, I should say, that is a contribution to advancing mankind beyond Spain, beyond Europe. And this is why I'm optimistic, why I'm optimistic that there's a chance even that the countries hardest hit can become leaders in that direction, including Spain. Okay.
We'll put the name of your website, and if people want to contact your foundation here in Spain, they can start working on your thoughts. Okay? All right. It was a pleasure to have you here, Matthias. Hope to see you soon in Barcelona. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for your time.